Gentleman yields back. Ms. Jayapal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to discuss the 85,000 so-called lost children that we've heard so much about in this committee. Mr. Carey, as you testified, the New York Times wrote a detailed article with some very concerning stories related to unaccompanied children unlawfully working in some very dangerous conditions. And I've said before that these incidents are extremely upsetting. They need to be addressed. The article also discussed how the Office of Refugee Resettlement did not know the whereabouts of those 85,000 unaccompanied children who have been released to sponsors since the Biden administration began. Many outlets and some of my colleagues have latched onto this headline to claim that the Biden administration has, quote, lost 85,000 children. And so I want to start with the most important question, because you ran the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Are those children actually lost by the federal government?
No, they are not. Approximately 85%, and during my tenure, 90% of those children were going to parents or very close relatives. Upwards of 70%, I believe, were going to their parents. So it was the reunification of families that was taking place. Now, it is true that some of those calls are not answered. However, not answering a phone call, I do not believe constitutes losing a child. There are some very legitimate reasons why those calls might not be answered. They are unknown numbers from the U.S. government. They're not recognized. I think that, understandably, people do not answer calls from unknown numbers. They may be fearful of traffickers, I don't know, other forces. So, in short, I do not believe that constitutes being lost.
So when somebody says lost, what they're talking about is that a phone call to verify and speak to the child was not answered. And then that gets constituted as, quote, lost. So if I remember correctly, in 2018, the previous administration was accused of the same issue when headlines appeared stating that the Trump administration lost 1,500 children in a 3-month period. Is that correct?
Yes.
And those claims were untrue as well?
I believe those claims were in fact true because the families were separated. Some children went at the time of entry, they were separated, and there were databases that did not track where the parents went and where the children went. So the situation was substantially different.
And you're talking about a time when the Trump administration actually separated thousands of children from their families. In fact, I remember going and visiting some of those parents in a federal detention center. They had no idea where their parents were, and in fact, the government had no idea where those kids were. Can you discuss why the Office of Refugee Resettlement does not do more in its follow-up? I mean, that is one of the things that has been raised that I think we all want to understand. In your opinion, what more could the Office of Refugee Resettlement be doing?
Well, I think it's important to understand what the parameters are on the ORR office operations. The statutory authority granted to ORR extends only up to the time of release. So ORR has no authority to track or to investigate. It's not an investigatory body. Or a law enforcement body. So while substantial resources are directed in that area, it lacks the expertise, tools, staff, and resources to conduct investigatory processes.
So you mentioned in your testimony that ORR has no authority over children working, for example, illegal child labor. Is that correct? ORR?
That is correct.
Who has responsibility for that?
That would be the Department of Labor, I believe.
So that is really not a function of ORR. I want to thank you, Mr. Carey, because I think this question of additional post-release services, and in fact, even some of the Republican witnesses have talked about this, I think that's an area that we believe is important to ensure that there are in-person follow-ups, to ensure that there is appointment of counsel. That's something we didn't cover, but that's only going to help ensure that these kids stay safe and that their claims are heard. So I appreciate your testimony. It's important that we get the facts out there, that we don't use the word lost in a way that's not factual, because really what we're talking about is a phone call was made and that was not responded to. That phone call was not responded to for all the reasons that you mentioned. I thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Biggs, very